In the winter of 1978, in a quiet corner of Northern California, 5 men left their homes for what should have been a simple Friday night. They were friends, close in their own way, connected not by work or school, but by routine, shared rhythms, and a basketball team they all loved. The small towns they came from, Yuba City, Marysville, and Olivehurst, were modest places, flatlands and quiet streets. Not far from Sacramento, but far enough that life moved slowly. Most people there worked blue-collar jobs or lived on fixed incomes. The kind of towns where people nodded at one another at gas stations, and where Friday nights rarely offered more than a TV dinner or a high school game. The 5 men at the center of this story had known each other for years. All of them were adults, ranging in age from 24 to 32, but they lived lives that were sheltered and dependent. Each of them had been diagnosed with mild intellectual disabilities or mental health conditions. Some lived with their parents. Others attended special education programs. Together, they formed a kind of chosen group, close-knit, predictable, and safe in each other's company. There was Jack Madruga, age 30, a quiet man who'd served briefly in the military, though it hadn't worked out. He had a driver's license and a 1969 Mercury Montego that he was proud of. Jack didn't like large crowds. He didn't drink. He followed a regular routine and lived with his mother in Marysville. Bill Sterling, 29, was deeply religious. He attended church regularly and was known to carry his Bible in his coat pocket. He was gentle, trusting, and had trouble with more abstract reasoning. He and Jack were especially close. Ted Weiher, 32, was cheerful, liked jokes, and had worked at a snack stand. He lived with his parents and needed structured support to manage daily responsibilities. He was warm-hearted and dependable, though he was easily influenced by others. Jack Hewitt, 24, was the youngest of the group. He struggled more significantly with understanding complex situations, but was affectionate, open, and eager to be included. He looked up to the other men. And then there was Gary Mathias, 25, the only one with a somewhat different history. Gary had once served in the Army. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia in his early 20s and had struggled with drug use in the past. But in the years leading up to 1978, he was stable, living with his parents, taking medication, and showing real improvement. He had a sharp wit and could talk quickly when he got going. His past made him a bit more unpredictable than the others, but among the group he was accepted, trusted. Together, they were part of a local basketball team organized for adults with developmental disabilities. They practiced regularly and were passionate about the game. On the night of Friday, February 24, 1978, they made plans to drive to Chico, about 50 miles north, to attend a college basketball game at California State University. Their team had a big game scheduled the next morning, one they had been talking about for weeks. It was part of a tournament sponsored by the Special Olympics. Each man had laid out their uniform the night before. Their mothers had reminded them not to stay out too late. They were excited. They left in Jack Madruga's Mercury. The drive up to Chico was uneventful. The game ended. They stopped afterward at a convenience store for snacks, Hostess pies, chocolate milk, soda. A clerk remembered them laughing, joking. There was no sign of tension, no odd behavior. Then they got back in the car and drove off into the night. That was the last time anyone saw them. The next morning came with quiet concern. When none of the men arrived at their game, their families were confused. These were not men who strayed far from plans. They followed routines closely. For them, missing a basketball game wasn't just unusual. It was unthinkable. Calls were made, first to each other, then to the police. And soon the waiting began. What would follow over the next months was not a quick disappearance or a single point of mystery. It would become a strange, stretched-out series of discoveries, scattered belongings, bodies found in unexplainable locations, and one man who was never found at all. No violence, no suspects, just questions, the kind that never settled. It was a Saturday morning like any other, except 5 men had not come home. The game they had spoken about so eagerly, the tournament they had planned for, was happening without them. And for their families, that made no sense. These were men who rarely missed appointments. Their lives were built around structure, around routine. Ted had laid out his basketball uniform the night before. Jack Hewitt had gone to bed early. Bill had reminded his mother about the event more than once. They were excited, not distracted. Focused, not impulsive. And now, no one knew where they were. At first, the worry was quiet. A few calls, some checking between family members. But by afternoon, concern turned to fear. The local police were notified. Missing person reports were filed. No one had seen the 5 men since they'd left Chico around 10 p.m. the night before. At first, officers considered the possibility that they had simply gotten lost. Maybe they had decided to drive somewhere else after the game. But their families pushed back. That wasn't how these men lived. None of them had a history of wandering. They didn't travel without telling someone. They didn't miss events they cared about. It took 2 days to locate the first real clue. On February 27th, a forest ranger reported an abandoned car spotted off a narrow road in the Plumas National Forest, deep in the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was a desolate place. Cold, remote, high in elevation, and in late February, still covered in snow. The road where the car had been found, Orleans Bar Road, was 70 miles from Chico. In the wrong direction. There was no reason for the men to be there. The vehicle was Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego, just as the families had described. It had not crashed. It wasn't stuck. It had simply been left, parked in the snow with the windows rolled down. The doors were unlocked. The keys were gone. Inside, there were food wrappers from the convenience store, those same snacks bought after the game. The wrappers were empty. The seats were clean. The car still had fuel in the tank, and when tested, it started immediately. It hadn't broken down. No signs of foul play. No blood. No struggle. It was as if the 5 men had driven far into the mountains, turned off a little-used road, stopped the car, and walked away. But why? None of them were dressed for snow. None of them had coats fit for freezing temperatures. They weren't experienced outdoorsmen. None of them had ever expressed interest in exploring that area. Their families couldn't make sense of it. More confusing still was how the car had reached that location. Orleans Bar Road was steep in places, rough in others, and bordered by thick woods and unmarked trails. Snowdrifts had covered parts of it that night. And yet, the car had no dents, no mud spatters, no obvious signs of struggling to get through. Authorities believed someone had either driven it carefully, or someone very familiar with the road had guided them. But that brought its own question. If they were with someone, who was it? Searches began immediately in the area around the car. Helicopters were brought in. Search and rescue teams fanned out across the woods, using snowshoes and dogs. Volunteers joined, moving slowly across ravines and ridgelines. The nights were cold, sub-freezing. The terrain was difficult, but there was hope that the men had found shelter somewhere nearby. A cabin, a trailhead, a ranger station. That hope didn't last. There were no footprints, no signs that the men had moved together. The snow made tracking difficult, but experienced searchers could tell. There had been no 5-person path leading away from the car. If they had left, it had either been before the snow fell, or one by one, not as a group. The families came to the site. They stood near the car. They asked the same questions the deputies were asking. Why would they be here? Why wouldn't they call? Why leave a perfectly working vehicle behind in the middle of a frozen forest? The days turned into a week. Then 2. The snow came heavier. The search was called off temporarily due to dangerous conditions. And still there was no sign of the men. Not clothing, not gear, not even a footprint. The media began to take interest. The case, already strange, was now being reported statewide. 5 men, all vulnerable, all missing without explanation, and a car left in the woods with no sign of damage. The phrase bizarre disappearance appeared in headlines. Some referred to the group as the boys, which their families resented. They were men, they reminded reporters. Adults, people with lives, with routines, with people who missed them. Back in Yuba City, neighbors brought food. Others helped distribute flyers. The basketball team played its next game in silence. And the families began to do what so many families of the missing do: wait, wonder, and try to hold on to the shape of someone they loved while the trail grew colder. The weeks passed. Winter turned slowly to spring. And then, for months later, the snow began to melt, and the forest began to speak. It was June 4th, 1978. For months after 5 men vanished into the Sierra Nevada foothills, the landscape had begun to thaw. Snow that once blanketed the forest had receded into the shaded slopes and streams, revealing branches, rock, and earth long hidden beneath the white. That morning, a group of motorcyclists rode through a remote stretch of road in the Plumas National Forest, miles from where Jack Madruga's car had been found in February. They were exploring a narrow trail off Rogers Cow Camp, near a U.S. Forest Service trailer site used in the summer months for maintenance crews. They weren't looking for anything, but what they found was unmistakable. Inside the trailer, cold, abandoned, and still, was a body. It was lying on a bed, partially wrapped in sheets. The man was thin, almost skeletal. His beard had grown. His feet were frostbitten. Nearby, there were several cans of C-ration food, military-style supplies left behind by Forest Service workers. Some had been opened and eaten. Others were untouched. On a table nearby, a ring of keys. On a shelf, a stack of paperback books. Folded clothing, sheets and blankets. There was also a working propane tank outside the trailer, which would have provided heat. It had never been used. The man inside was later identified as Ted Weiher. He had died there alone, likely weeks after the others disappeared. A coroner's report later suggested Ted had survived as long as 8 to 13 weeks, meaning he had lived into late April, possibly early May. His body showed signs of severe weight loss, more than 80 pounds lost. His feet were badly damaged from exposure, yet he had remained wrapped in bedding, with food around him. Clothing had been taken from elsewhere in the trailer, used for warmth, and someone had lit a few candles, placed neatly beside his bed. But no fire had been made, and no attempt had been made to activate the gas heater, which was in working order. There was no visible sign of injury, no blood, no defensive wounds, no forced entry. Just a man who had somehow found shelter, had food available, had warmth within reach, and yet slowly deteriorated day by day until he slipped away. The location of the trailer made the situation even more strange. It was roughly 20 miles on foot from where the car had been abandoned, uphill through heavy snow, rugged terrain, and dense forest. The walk would have taken them deep into the wilderness. No maps had marked the trailer. There were no signs to guide them. How had Ted arrived there? And more importantly, had he come alone? The discovery reignited the search. With the snow now melted and a body confirmed, authorities returned to the forest with renewed urgency. They scoured the surrounding land, and within just days more would be found. Roughly 11 miles back toward the location of the car, they came across Jack Madruga's body. He was lying in the underbrush, not far from a dirt road. The cause of death appeared to be hypothermia. His car keys were still in his pocket. Nearby, they found the remains of Bill Sterling, scattered by animals. Too little remained to determine an exact cause of death. But his body was near Jack's, and their location suggested they had traveled together, at least part of the way. A few days later, closer to the trailer, they found the partial remains of Jack Hewitt. His backbone and a few other bones were identified by dental records and clothing. He had not made it to the shelter either. He had died somewhere in between. Only Gary Mathias was still missing. Of the 5 men, he was the one with military experience. He had known how to camp. He had been familiar with survival basics. His shoes had been found inside the trailer, neatly placed, which meant at some point he had likely been there, with Ted, but his body was never found. Searchers combed the area around the trailer again and again. They brought in dogs, helicopters, and even specialized cadaver search teams. Nothing. No remains. No clothing. No trail. Only his shoes, left behind in the place where Ted had died. The facts were now clear, but the meaning of them was not. 5 men had gone missing after a basketball game. They had driven 70 miles in the wrong direction, into the mountains. Their car had been left in good condition. No one had called for help, for were found dead. One was never found at all, and no one, not the families, the authorities, nor the volunteers who had searched for months, could explain why any of it had happened. The case, which had already drawn quiet public interest, was now something else. No foul play, no suspects, no sign of violence, just a deep and confusing silence, broken only by the strange details that emerged piece by piece. Details that didn't align, behaviors that didn't fit, survival choices that didn't make sense. And at the center of it all, 5 men, all known for following routine, all dependent on structure, who had somehow ended up in one of the most remote, snow-covered places in Northern California, without gear, without clear intent, and ultimately without life. The question, from that moment forward, would no longer be where they were, but why they had gone there at all. The Forest Service trailer where Ted Weiher was found became the center of everything that remained unanswered. Even as more bodies were recovered from the hills nearby, it was this small, silent shelter, tucked into the wilderness and left undisturbed for months, that held the greatest weight. Not just because Ted had died there, but because of what had been left untouched inside. When authorities entered the trailer that day in June, they found no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no pried doors. It was unlocked. The supply room had been accessed. Blankets had been pulled out and used. Canned food had been opened. Rations left behind by Forest Service workers who used the trailer seasonally. Ted had eaten some of it, but not much. And strangely, a large supply of food remained unopened. Over a dozen cans, untouched and sitting neatly in storage. On a nearby table was a 1-year supply of dehydrated meals, never unboxed. The trailer had heat. A propane tank sat just outside, fully intact and connected to a wall-mounted heater. The controls were simple. Instructions were posted. No attempt had been made to use it. The beds had mattresses, sheets, pillows. Ted had used them, partially. He had wrapped himself in blankets. But other comforts went unused. Several items had been placed nearby, as if considered but never touched. A stack of paperbacks, a jacket, a candle burned down. His body, when found, showed signs that he had lived for weeks after the others had died. He had been waiting, perhaps for help, perhaps for someone to return, perhaps for someone who never did. And still the heater remained unused. Investigators were cautious not to jump to conclusions. The evidence didn't suggest foul play. Ted had not been murdered. He had not suffered trauma. His body showed signs of cold exposure and starvation. But what puzzled everyone most was how unnecessary his death seemed. He had food. He had shelter. He had the means to stay alive, at least for a while. And still he had faded. Slowly, quietly, wrapped in bedding, with food uneaten just feet away. Why? Ted had not been alone, at least not at first. Gary Mathias's shoes were there, not just near the door, but inside the trailer. Neatly placed, not discarded but exchanged. And next to them, Ted's own shoes were missing. Investigators believed that at some point, Gary had given Ted his boots, possibly because Ted's feet were swollen or frostbitten. The gesture suggested care. It suggested intention. It suggested that Gary had been there and had left. But if Gary had left, where had he gone? The area was searched again and again. Dozens of square miles. Forest, ravines, riverbeds. No trace of Gary was ever found. No bone fragment. No clothing. No gear. Not even a single footprint leading away from the trailer. As if he had vanished. And then came the hardest question of all. Why had they gone into the forest in the first place? It was a question no one could answer. The 5 men had left a basketball game in Chico. The road they were found on was nowhere near the direct route home. It led east into the mountains. Steep, winding, and snow-covered in places, the road was difficult even for experienced locals. They had no reason to be there. No destination in that direction. No connection to the forest. No experience with snow hiking. No gear. No plans. And yet there they were. Their families couldn't make sense of it. The men had followed routine closely in their day-to-day lives. They weren't impulsive. They didn't take detours. They didn't go off the grid. They had a game scheduled the next morning. They were excited for it. They had uniforms laid out. Why then did they head into the cold? And why did none of them ever call for help? Their car had gas. It hadn't broken down. There was a pay phone along the route, but no call was made. The car was left unlocked, undamaged, with snack wrappers still inside. No sign of panic, just silence. Some speculated that the group had taken a wrong turn. Others wondered if they had followed someone, perhaps someone they trusted, someone who led them there. But no such person was ever identified. No vehicle was ever spotted behind them. No one came forward. There were theories, but no answers. The families grieved, but they also searched. Not just physically, but mentally. They tried to fill the gaps. To understand, they spoke with doctors. They revisited old conversations. They wondered whether the men had misjudged the road, whether fear or confusion had kept them from turning back, whether once the car was stopped, a group decision had been made to find shelter, no matter how far they had to walk. Still, the behavior inside the trailer puzzled everyone. Why not eat the rest of the food? Why not use the heat? Why had Ted waited so long? Long enough to starve, long enough to die, without trying to leave. The truth was simple and devastating. No one knew, and with Gary still missing, the last living thread of the story had unraveled into silence. From a basketball game on a Friday night to a trailer in the forest months later, the story of the Yuba County Five was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something else, a sequence of small, impossible choices made quietly, in the dark, and without explanation. And in that silence, families were left not with closure, but with questions that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Of the 5 men who vanished in the winter of 1978, only one was never found. His name was Gary Mathias, and for investigators, he remained the most difficult part of an already confounding case. Not only because he had disappeared without a trace, but because of who he was before that night, and what he might have known in the hours after they left the car behind. Gary was different from the others in subtle but important ways. He had served in the United States Army, stationed in West Germany, though his service was cut short. After returning home, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that led to multiple episodes, including a few run-ins with the law and a brief period of instability. At one point, he had been arrested for assault, another time for public intoxication. But by the time he met the others, Ted, Jack, Bill, and Jack Hewitt, Gary was in a better place. He was receiving treatment. He had found the right medication. He was living at home with his parents in Olivehurst. And more than that, he was social, sharp, even charismatic in small groups. He liked to talk, to debate, to tease. His parents described him as high-functioning when stable, someone who understood his limits and stuck to his regimen. He was well-liked by the group. Trusted. Gary's friendship with the others had grown naturally. He played on their basketball team. He joined in outings. He often spent time at their homes. Unlike some of the others, Gary could read social cues. He could navigate unfamiliar situations. And though his schizophrenia remained a part of his life, he hadn't experienced a serious episode in over 2 years, which is why his disappearance stood apart. Gary's shoes were found in the trailer where Ted died. His sturdy boots had been left neatly beside the bed. Ted's lighter shoes were gone, presumably worn by Gary when he left. But that left investigators wondering why he had given up better footwear in freezing temperatures. Perhaps Ted's feet were badly frostbitten, and Gary gave him his boots. Perhaps Gary planned to go for help, or perhaps something else had happened. But no trail followed. Despite extensive searching in the surrounding forest, no trace of Gary Mathias was ever found. No bones, no clothing, no path. It was as if he had stepped into the trees and disappeared completely. That, more than anything else, disturbed those who remained. If Gary had died near the trailer, his remains would likely have been found, as the others were. If he had made it to a road or a clearing, he might have been seen. And if he had returned to civilization, someone somewhere would have noticed. Yet nothing. Authorities considered several possibilities. The first was that Gary had died somewhere nearby, and his remains simply hadn't been found. The second, more unsettling theory was that he had survived and left the area entirely. But if he had survived, why hadn't he contacted anyone? His medication was time-sensitive. Without it, his mental health could spiral. But there had been no record of him seeking help at a clinic. No sightings confirmed. No bank accounts used. His social security number remained dormant. His driver's license never resurfaced. His family, understandably, hoped he had survived. Perhaps, in a dissociative state, he had wandered away, confused. Maybe he had been picked up, unable to explain who he was. Maybe he had been living under another name, somewhere distant. The world was large. He could be anywhere. But those hopes were hard to hold. Years passed, then decades, and still Gary never came home. Of all the unknowns in the Yuba County Five case, Gary's absence remained the sharpest. Because while the others had been found, Jack, Bill, Jack Hewitt, and Ted, Gary's path after the trailer ended without any visible sign. It added weight to the questions that surrounded the case. Had he been the one to lead them there? Or had he, like the rest, simply followed? There had been talk early on that Gary might have convinced the others to take a detour. That perhaps he had wanted to visit someone, an old friend, or a family member who lived near the mountains. That he had meant to drive into the forest and got lost. But this theory never held. There was no one he knew in that area. And Jack Madruga, the driver, wouldn't have given up the wheel for any reason. His mother had said it clearly. Jack was protective of his car. He didn't let anyone else drive. So why had they gone there? That question came back again and again. And it always circled back to Gary, the one who had navigated the world more easily. The one who had been through things the others hadn't. The one who had, perhaps, known more about what was happening that night than anyone else. But with no voice to explain it, everything was left to interpretation. And families were left with grief that had no direction. Not because they blamed him, but because he might have understood something, even briefly, that they never would. Gary Mathias remains listed as missing to this day. Not deceased, not found, just absent. In every database, his name appears with the same image. A young man, sharp-eyed, dark-haired, in his 20s. Time has moved forward, but that image has not changed. No age progression sketches. No sightings confirmed. Only a man who walked into a snowy forest, and like the others, never came back. Except the others were found, and he never was. To understand how 5 men from Yuba City ended up in the Plumas National Forest, one has to return to the evening of February 24, 1978, and walk through it. Not in speculation, but in the quiet, confirmed steps that preceded their disappearance. That Friday evening was clear and cold. The kind of winter night where the stars settle into sharp focus and the air, even in low valleys, carries a distinct bite. The 5 men, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Ted Weiher, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias, were headed to Chico, a college town about an hour's drive north, to attend a basketball game at California State University. They weren't playing that night. Their own Special Olympics tournament was scheduled for the next morning, and they had been talking about it all week. But they wanted to watch a game, to be in the crowd, to cheer. They left in Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego, sometime around 5:30 p.m. No one knows the exact moment, only that they left on time, dressed casually, excited for the trip. The route to Chico was straightforward. They would have taken Highway 70 to Highway 99, wide, smooth roads with familiar turns. They made it to the game without issue. The players on the court didn't know who they were. To them, they were just 5 young men in the stands, smiling, watching, blending into the crowd. After the game ended, sometime after 10 p.m., the group stopped at a Bears Market convenience store in downtown Chico. The clerk on duty later described them as friendly. They bought a few snacks, Hostess pies, chocolate milk, a couple of sodas. All 5 were present. Nothing seemed strange. No one was in distress. Then they got back in the car. And what happened next remains unknown. They didn't drive south toward home. Instead, they took a turn that made no sense. Instead of heading back down Highway 99, the Mercury was later found far to the east, off a narrow mountain road deep in the Sierra Nevada foothills. That road, Orleans Bar Road, is steep, winding, and rarely used during winter. It leads into Forest Service land, ending near a cluster of abandoned cabins and an unstaffed trailer used by seasonal crews. It's not a shortcut. It's not scenic. It's not a place one finds by accident. The distance from Chico to where the car was eventually discovered was roughly 70 miles, but in the wrong direction and over terrain completely unfamiliar to the men. The area was desolate, especially that time of year. Nighttime temperatures dropped well below freezing. The road was partly snow-covered, lined with ditches and sharp drop-offs. Authorities later tried to retrace the route. They found no reason someone would end up there unless they had a specific destination in mind, or unless they had made a mistake and continued driving out of confusion or fear. There were no confirmed sightings after the store stop, no witnesses who saw them turning east, no surveillance footage placing them outside of Chico after 10:15 p.m. And then, 3 days later, Jack's Mercury was found abandoned in the snow. The car, strangely, didn't show signs of trouble. The tires had sunk slightly into the snow, but the undercarriage wasn't damaged. It had gas. The keys were gone, but the battery worked. The doors were unlocked. The windows rolled down. The wrappers from the snacks they had purchased were still inside. One odd detail. Investigators believed 4 people had likely left the car. Only 4 sets of impressions were found in the snow, though they were already fading when searchers arrived. That 5th trail, if it ever existed, was lost to time. Why had they abandoned the vehicle? Why hadn't they walked downhill, toward help, instead of uphill into the forest? And why hadn't anyone tried to flag down assistance on the drive east? If they had taken a wrong turn, surely they would have noticed. There were towns, gas stations, places to stop, yet none of those options were used. And this raised a quiet but persistent theory. Had someone else been in the car? Had they followed someone? Had they been running from something? There was no evidence of that, but there was also no evidence against it. In the days that followed, the families sat together, trying to piece it together. They reviewed everything: the route, the behavior, the timeline. Jack Madruga, the driver, did not like the cold. He hated camping, his mother said. He wasn't spontaneous. He didn't let others drive his car. And yet, his car had ended up in the High Sierra, in a place he had never spoken of and likely never seen. Gary Mathias had a friend who lived in Forbestown, about halfway between Chico and the mountain. That led some to wonder, had they planned to stop there? Had they missed a turn? But the route didn't match. And there was no evidence they ever went near Forbestown at all. Instead, all roads led to that one strange location in the mountains. That empty road. That working car. And then nothing. No calls to home. No search for help. No explanation. Only silence. The last known decision they made was to buy snacks after the game. Everything after that was guesswork. And as search teams moved further into the forest, through melting snow and rising spring temperatures, what they began to uncover was not clarity. It was confusion, layered, expanding, deepened by every step they took. When the bodies began to appear in the Sierra Nevada woods, the nature of the story changed. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It became something more unsettled. A discovery, yes, but one that carried no relief. Only deeper questions. The families of the 5 men were notified gently, but directly. First Ted Weiher, then Jack Madruga, then Bill Sterling, then Jack Hewitt. One by one, the news arrived. 4 of the 5 had been found, all of them dead, all of them in varying conditions, across miles of rugged terrain, scattered along the invisible path that stretched between the abandoned Mercury and the Forest Service trailer where Ted had waited out his final days. Only Gary Mathias remained unaccounted for. The news came slowly, and for the families, it did not come with the closure some might expect. It came instead with confusion and something harder to name. The men had not died violently. There were no signs of injury, no indication that someone had harmed them. But the way they had died, and the circumstances in which they were found, didn't feel like the result of simple misjudgment. Jack Madruga's body had been found in open ground, not far from where Bill Sterling's remains had also surfaced. Both had succumbed to the cold, likely within a day or two of abandoning the car. Their clothing had been disturbed by animals. Their positions suggested they had collapsed where they stood. There had been no shelter, no attempts to start a fire, no sign that they'd tried to return. Further up, nearly 12 miles into the woods, Ted had made it into the trailer. The evidence suggested he had lived the longest, perhaps 2 months or more, wasting away in the quiet, surrounded by food and warmth he never fully accessed. The stillness of his final days, the blankets pulled up around him, the shoes removed, the unopened cans, haunted those who read the reports. And somewhere between these 2 points, near a stream bed, Jack Hewitt's bones were recovered. Weathered, partial, far enough from the others to suggest he had separated from the group, but close enough that he likely shared their final hours. There was no trail linking them. No footprints, of course. Too much time had passed. But the map drawn by their remains told a story that no one could quite understand. It didn't follow logic. It didn't fit the personalities of the men. It didn't match what their families knew to be true about how they behaved, how they thought, or how they made decisions. And in the middle of that story was the car, still parked in the snow, fully functional, just a few short miles downhill from a ranger station that could have offered safety. The families tried to make sense of it, but the details didn't add up. Ted's family couldn't understand why he hadn't eaten the rest of the food, why he hadn't used the heater, why he hadn't tried to walk out once the weather cleared. He was not impulsive. He followed direction well. He would have waited for help, but if he had survived into spring, why hadn't he called out? Why had he allowed himself to wither slowly in silence? Jack Madruga's mother pointed out that her son didn't like the outdoors. He would never have willingly driven into the snow. If he had gotten lost, he would have turned around. He hated cold. He didn't like the woods. Something, or someone must have led him there. Bill Sterling's family struggled to understand why the men had kept walking. If the car worked, if it had gas, why had they not driven back down the road? They had a basketball game the next morning. Their uniforms were laid out. They had been excited. There was no reason to run. The Hewitts said little. Jack was the youngest of the group, and among the most vulnerable. He would have followed the others without question. He wouldn't have left on his own. He wouldn't have had the ability to lead. His death felt like a byproduct of something larger, something he had simply been swept into. And then there was Gary. No one could say what had happened to him. His boots had been left behind. His medication was gone. His mother believed for a long time that he had survived. Maybe he had walked further. Maybe someone had picked him up. Maybe he had been trying to get help and failed. Or maybe, harder to admit, he hadn't made it far at all, and his body simply hadn't been found. But even that was hard to believe, because in all the space that had been searched, nothing turned up. No sign of where he had gone. Or why? Investigators reviewed the case again and again. There were no signs of foul play, no trauma on the bodies, no evidence of third-party involvement. The working theory, if one could be called that, was that the men had become lost, disoriented. Perhaps they believed someone was chasing them. Perhaps they panicked. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. There was no stranger reported in the area that night. No nearby vehicle seen. No threatening call. No note. Just silence. The case was left open but inactive. There was no evidence to pursue. No next step to take. And yet, for the families, it never really ended. They continued to live with it. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as an absence that shaped every day forward. What made the story harder was that the men had not died together. They had separated. Slowly. Quietly. Ted had lived for weeks in the trailer. That meant he was alone. Or perhaps not for a while. Perhaps Gary had stayed. Perhaps he had gone for help. But the loneliness of it, the waiting, the hunger, the cold, was unbearable to think about. That, more than anything, is what the families held on to. Not just that they had died, but that they had died in the dark. Not understanding why they were there. Not understanding why no one had come. As the years passed and no new answers emerged, the disappearance and deaths of the Yuba County Five settled into a place that few cases ever quite reach. It became known not only as a mystery, but as a kind of symbol. A story with clear facts, physical evidence, and a precise timeline, but no understandable logic. A case where nearly everything was found, except for the reason why. In time, it was given a name by those who tried to understand it from a distance: America's Dyatlov Pass. A reference to a 1959 incident in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, where 9 experienced hikers were found dead under strange and unexplained circumstances. Much like that case, the story of the Yuba County Five involved a remote, cold location, a group of people acting out of character, and no conclusive answers. But unlike Dyatlov Pass, the men in this case weren't hikers. They weren't explorers. They didn't go into the mountains for a challenge or a thrill. They had gone to a basketball game in Chico. They had stopped for snacks. And then, for reasons no one could explain, they ended up on a snow-covered road in the forest, abandoning a perfectly working car and walking into the dark. That contrast between the normal and the unthinkable was what made the case so unsettling. It wasn't that something terrible had clearly happened. It was that something confusing had, and that confusion only deepened the more the facts were laid bare. The trailer where Ted Weiher died remained a focal point for investigators and journalists who later revisited the story. The unused heater, the untouched food, the fact that he had likely lived for weeks, waiting, surrounded by supplies that could have saved him. The small signs of survival, cans opened, candles burned, shoes exchanged, suggested some kind of intention. Someone had tried to live, but the choices made inside that trailer didn't follow any predictable path. The absence of Gary Mathias only added to the story's weight. His shoes were found, but his body never was. His background was different from the others. He was more independent, more capable of surviving outdoors. He had once lived without housing during a period of instability, and yet not a trace of him was ever recovered. His name still appears in missing persons databases. Still active, still open. No one knows if he died shortly after leaving the trailer, or if he made it farther, or if, for a time, he survived and simply slipped away unnoticed. Speculation, as always, followed. Some believed the men had been chased, that someone or something had frightened them into the woods. But there was no sign of pursuit, no defensive wounds, no evidence of vehicles or footprints other than their own. Others wondered whether Gary had experienced a psychotic break and the others had followed him, trusting his judgment. But his medication was still in effect at the time, and he hadn't shown signs of instability in the weeks before. There were even theories that a third party had lured them into the mountains, or that they had witnessed something they weren't meant to see. But there were no phone calls, no notes, no sightings, and no evidence. In the end, the investigation could only go as far as the facts allowed. No crimes had been committed. The men had died of exposure. The terrain was harsh. The winter cold had done what time always does to unprepared bodies in the forest. But the question that hung in the air was not how they died. It was why they had gone there at all. In the years that followed, the story remained alive, not in daily headlines, but in the minds of those who had tried to understand it. Journalists revisited it. True crime writers analyzed it. Local law enforcement kept the files. And every few years, a new reader would discover the story for the first time and be pulled into its quiet confusion. The families, for the most part, stepped away from public attention. They had lived with the questions for too long to expect new ones would bring peace. They did not ask for attention. They did not push for dramatic retellings. They had accepted what was known and grieved what would never be. What endured was the stillness of it all. 5 men went to a basketball game. 4 were found. 1 was not. No violence. No evidence of crime. No logical explanation. Just a group of close-knit, vulnerable adults who, for one unknown reason, made a series of choices that led them deep into a cold, unforgiving forest, where they separated, waited, and slowly disappeared. Not all mysteries shout. Some whisper. This one never made a sound. Long after the snow melted and the bodies were recovered, the case moved into a quieter chapter. One where there were no more updates, no new discoveries, and no illusions that more answers would come. What remained was memory, not just in the minds of investigators or those who had followed the story in newspapers, but in the homes of 5 families who still lived with a kind of absence that time never fully erases. In Yuba City, Marysville, and Olivehurst, the names of the men weren't forgotten. Their faces were remembered in yearbooks, in old photos hung in living rooms, in framed basketball team pictures that hadn't been taken down. The story didn't fade completely, but it did fall out of the public eye. Not because it no longer mattered, but because there was nothing left to say. There were no court dates, no arrests, no press conferences, no final headline to bring things to a close. The official cause of death was hypothermia. The unofficial cause was mystery. And yet, within the families, the memory of who they were, beyond the headlines, beyond the tragedy, remained vivid. Jack Madruga was remembered as gentle, respectful, and quiet. He didn't go out of his way to make waves. He loved his car, took care of it like it was an extension of himself. He had served in the military. He was proud of that. He liked routine, didn't care for surprises, and didn't go places he didn't know. Bill Sterling was known for his calm spirit. He went to church regularly. He enjoyed helping others. He walked with a slight shuffle and kept his thoughts simple. He saw the good in people. He didn't like confrontation. He didn't like the dark. Ted Weiher made people laugh. He was warm and approachable, the kind of person who asked questions that were sometimes offbeat, but always sincere. He'd worked at a snack bar and loved basketball more than anything. His death in the trailer, so slow and quiet, remained the part of the story his family found hardest to carry. Jack Hewitt was the youngest. He was affectionate, openly trusting, and looked up to the older men as big brothers. He rarely spoke up, but when he did, it was often with simple kindness. He wouldn't have led the group, but he would have followed them anywhere. And Gary Mathias, the one who was never found, remained a kind of question mark in the shape of a person. His family held on to the hope that he had survived, even as the years passed. They clung to the possibility that he had simply vanished into the margins of the world, confused or in crisis, and never resurfaced. Others thought he had died like the rest, just not where anyone had looked. But no one could say for sure. He had once been unstable. He had once overcome that, and then, like the others, he was gone. The investigators who worked the case retired. Some passed away. New officers came in, inherited the files, and reopened them every so often. Not because there was something new, but because no one wanted to say it was closed. The case remained officially open, unofficially dormant. And still, every so often, someone would mention the case. A news segment on unsolved mysteries, a blog post, a podcast, a conversation between 2 people who remembered the strange case of the 5 men who vanished after a basketball game. And each time, someone would ask the question again. Why did they go there? It wasn't just a question about geography. It was about intent, about what shifted in that car between Chico and the snow-covered mountains, about what they saw or thought they saw, about who might have spoken or stayed silent, and about why, when safety was behind them and the cold ahead, they kept walking. But no answers ever followed, only the known facts, which never changed, and the deeper sense that this wasn't a story with missing pieces. This was a story where the pieces didn't fit. In time, the case settled into its final shape, not as a crime, but as a mystery that refused to be solved. And in its silence, it offered something different than resolution. It offered a kind of enduring weight, a caution, a memory, that even in a world mapped and measured, a single turn down a quiet road can lead to a place no one expected. And that sometimes people disappear not all at once, but slowly, step by step, into the snow. In the long, slow years after the discovery of the 4 bodies, the question was no longer just about what had happened that February night in 1978. It became something more personal, something quieter. How do families live with not knowing? What shape does grief take when it isn't wrapped in answers? And what does remembrance look like when the story has no end? For the families of the Yuba County Five, the loss did not come all at once. It came in pieces. First, the phone calls that weren't returned. Then the drive to Chico looking for signs. then the search parties and the empty roads and the cold days that followed. Then the car, parked and untouched. Then months later, the news of bodies. All except one. And through it all, the quiet weight of not understanding why. These were not families unaccustomed to worry. Each of the men lived with limitations that made them vulnerable in different ways. But they were not helpless. They were not aimless. Their families understood their rhythms, knew their habits, trusted their judgment within the boundaries they had always stayed inside. That's what made it so difficult. What happened that night didn't match anything that had come before. None of them had a reason to disappear. None of them had a reason to go into the mountains. And yet they did. After the discoveries, the funerals were small and somber, held quietly without spectacle. There was no media presence, just family, friends, and neighbors. People who had known the men not as victims or headlines, but simply as who they had always been, sons, brothers, teammates, familiar faces in the community. No one gave eulogies filled with big words or sweeping declarations. The grief in the room was heavy and quiet, the kind that sits on your chest, the kind that doesn't fade once the service is over. In the months that followed, the families returned to their routines because they had to. But routines felt different now. The little things carried weight. A shirt left folded on a shelf. A basketball jersey still hanging. A favorite meal no longer cooked. The silence of a bedroom with the door always half open. Not because someone might come back, but because closing it would make it too final. Some of the families kept in touch with one another. Others chose distance. Each person carried their loss differently. Some sought out support groups. Others stayed quiet. For all of them, the same strange tension remained. The deaths were confirmed, but the why never was. It was grief without a full shape. Mourning wrapped in confusion. They weren't looking for someone to blame. There was no clear enemy. No court case. No trial. Only the cold and the forest and choices that had never been explained. Some believed they had followed someone that night, perhaps a stranger, perhaps a friend. Others wondered if Gary had led them up the mountain, unintentionally or not. But none of those ideas could be proven, and none could undo the facts. The men had walked into the woods, and only one, Ted, had made it as far as shelter. And even then, survival had somehow remained out of reach. For Gary Mathias's family, the silence was different. Their son had never been found. They had no grave to visit, no final answers, just a name on a missing persons report and an image that hadn't aged in over 4 decades. At first, they believed he was still alive. They had to. There were no remains, no confirmed sightings, but also no confirmed end. That kind of uncertainty doesn't go away easily. Every quiet phone call, every knock on the door, every stranger seen from a distance with the same build, the same walk. It never fully stopped. Over time, that hope softened, not because they gave up, but because they had to survive it. It became part of their life, a quiet truth they didn't speak of often, but always carried. And if Gary had survived, if he had managed to find his way out and into the world beyond, he had left everything behind to do so. His name, his family, his life. There had never been any evidence that he had started a new one. The case stayed open in name only. Investigators kept it on file, and every few years, someone would revisit it. But there was never anything new. No fresh leads. No evidence found during forest work. No bones. No witness. No note. Nothing to make sense of what had already been discovered. In time, the families came to understand that they would likely never know. And knowing that you'll never know becomes its own kind of clarity. Not peace. Not acceptance. Just a way to breathe around the question. They still remembered the men as they were. On the basketball court. Laughing at the store. Sitting together in cars or at kitchen tables. They weren't defined by the way they died. They were remembered for how they lived, with small joys, simple routines, and steady friendships. That, in the end, is what they left behind. Not a trail through the snow, but the echo of who they had been before the cold. In the years that followed, the story of the Yuba County Five never entirely disappeared. It didn't linger in the news or make regular headlines. It lived somewhere quieter, in whispers, in memory, in the minds of those drawn to the kinds of stories that resist explanation. What made this case different wasn't just that it remained unsolved, it was that it seemed so close to being understood. The men weren't strangers to each other. They weren't unknown to their families. Their movements, at least early on, were traceable. The last night was mapped in gas stations, ticket stubs, and snack wrappers. And yet, it veered away from logic in the space between two destinations. They had been on their way home, and somehow they ended up 20 miles into the mountains. That space, the place between what was expected and what happened, became the thing that people couldn't forget. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It wasn't theatrical. It was a quiet story, and it stayed that way. Years turned into decades. Local newspapers wrote anniversary articles now and then. A few national outlets covered the story as part of larger pieces about unsolved mysteries. Occasionally, it resurfaced in documentaries or podcasts. Sometimes it was retold respectfully. Other times, it was turned into speculation, into the kind of mystery people like to puzzle over, removed from the lives it affected. But the people who had known the five men remembered them not as a puzzle, but as people. Jack, Bill, Ted, Jack, Gary. They were more than the way their story ended. They were sons, brothers, friends, community members. They had favorite songs, inside jokes, small habits. They weren't defined by the snow or the trailer or the missing footprints. They were remembered for who they were before the silence, for their routines, their loyalty to one another, their excitement for a game they never got to play. In time, the story became a kind of lesson, not in what to do or what to fear, but in how life doesn't always resolve itself. That even when we think we understand the people we love, there can be moments of disorientation that make no sense from the outside. That vulnerability doesn't always look dramatic. That safety isn't always enough. It became a reference point for those who study missing persons cases. A reminder that disappearance isn't always about being taken. Sometimes it's about being lost, mentally or physically. Sometimes it's about a series of quiet decisions that, in the moment, don't feel like decisions at all. And it also became a reminder of compassion. These five men were not reckless. They were not broken. They were people who moved through the world with care, with support, with trust in one another. They were failed not by some villain in the dark, but by circumstances no one could see coming, by a night that turned colder than expected, by a forest that didn't offer direction, by the absence of someone at the right place at the right time to help. That's what haunted those who knew them, how close they had been to safety, and how far that had turned out to be. Today, there's no monument, no official plaque, just a memory that lives in a handful of hearts, and in a small corner of true crime history where stories are told softly, without resolution, without judgment, just five men, one car, a forest, and a silence that still hasn't ended. In the end, what remains isn't an answer. It's a quiet shape, a long pause in a place where a sentence should have ended. The story of the Yuba County Five didn't conclude in the way we're taught stories do. There was no arrest, no confession, no final moment where everything clicked into place. What it left behind was something harder to carry. Grief shaped like confusion, memory wrapped in cold, and the echo of questions that were never fully spoken aloud. And yet this story has never truly faded. Not in the lives of the families who still remember the sound of each man's voice. Not in the forest that, each spring, thaws back into silence. Not in the archives or the old case files, or the shelves where a single folder still bears five names. It lives quietly, as some stories do. In a different world, the five of them would have played that game the next day. They would have worn their uniforms, shared snacks, laughed about the college match in Chico, gone home to their routines, and the night of February 24th, 1978, would have been nothing more than another ride back along a dark highway. But instead, they took a turn, and no one knows why. They didn't tell anyone. They didn't leave a note. They didn't leave much behind at all. Only a trail made of silence. Only footsteps that melted away before they could be followed. Their story is not told in shouts. It isn't meant to be solved in a single sitting, or dissected until it makes sense. It's meant to be remembered, as it was, strange, gentle, and sad, not because of what happened, but because of how little we can ever truly know about the moments people vanish. Sometimes the unanswered is not a riddle. Sometimes it's just the quiet that follows after a question no one heard. So this is where their story rests. In 5 names, 4 recovered, 1 still missing, and a stillness that no time has managed to break. Because some stories are not puzzles. They're reminders that even with maps and roads and routines, it's still possible to get lost.